Hi guys, we're on to the next chapter. Are there any small children in the room? If so, it would be best if we just let them think this really is the end of the story and hurried them off to bed, because this is where things start to get, well, awesome, but in a horrible, bloody kind of way. As the ship plowed through the purple sea, the new lovers made moon faces at each other up near the bow. Faithful Johannes was sitting near the back of the ship, admiring the success of his plan, when he noticed 3 ravens alight on a mast beam. The first raven motioned with his beak at the king and princess. "What a lovely couple those 2 make," he said. And the second said, "Yes, too bad they won't stay that way." The first said, "What do you mean?" "Well," the second replied, "when the ship gets to land, a beautiful chestnut stallion will canter up to the group, and the king will decide to ride it back to the castle. But if he does, he will be thrown from its back and die." "Good God, that's horrible," said the first raven. "Is there nothing anyone can do?" "Oh, there is," said the second raven. "Someone could kill the horse before the king mounts it. But what good is that? For if someone did it and told why he did it, he would be turned to stone from the tips of his toes to the knobs of his knees." "To stone?" asked the first raven. "To stone," answered the second. The third raven, who'd been listening quietly, cut in at this point. "It gets worse, you know," he said. "If by some chance the 2 lovers escape that danger, another lies ahead. For when they arrive at the gates of the castle, a beautiful bridal gown made of pure gold will be laid out on a bed of purple flowers. The princess will want to wear it, of course, but if she touches it, she will be consumed by a ball of fire and burned to a cinder right there on the spot." "Good goodness, that's terrible," cried the first raven. "Is there nothing anyone can do?" "Oh, there is," said the third raven. "If someone were to pick up the dress before she could and throw it at the fire, the princess would live. But what good is that? For if someone did it and told why he did it, he would be turned to stone, from the knobs of his knees to the core of his heart." "To stone?" repeated the first raven. "To stone," confirmed the third. "Nor is that all," said the second raven morosely. "For if the 2 lovers avoid this tragedy, a final one awaits. When they are married and begin the wedding dance, the new queen will swoon and fall to the floor and die." "Good God, that's the worst thing ever," cried the first raven. "Is there nothing anyone can do?" "Oh, there is," said the third. "If someone were to bite the new queen's lip and suck 3 drops of blood from it with his mouth, she would live. But what good is that? For if someone did it and told why he did it, he would be turned to stone from the core of his heart to the top of his head." "To stone?" said the first. "To stone," replied the second. "To stone," echoed the third. And with that, the 3 ravens shook their black beaks, sighed sadly, and flew away. Faithful Johannes buried his head in his hands, for he had heard all. He knew what he would have to do, and that it could not come to good. Just as the ravens had foretold, after the ship landed and the king and his wife-to-be had been greeted by all the servants and courtiers of the castle, a beautiful chestnut stallion cantered up to the group. The king, taken with the beast's beauty, announced that it would bear him in triumph back to the castle. But before he could mount it, Johannes slipped onto its back, drew a blade, and cut the horse's throat, soaking its silken coat with warm red blood. It collapsed to the ground in a heap. Cries of shock went up from the crowd. The other servants, who had never loved mishappen, Johannes whispered, "To kill the king's new stallion? Treason! Treason!" The king looked back and forth between Johannes and the dead horse. Johannes's face had no expression. At last the young king said, "Johannes was faithful to my father, and faithful to my father's father, and to my father's father's father before that. He has always understood us, so I will understand him. If he does it, it must be right." Not another word was said about the subject, and the party proceeded afoot back to the palace. When they arrived at the gate, they saw a beautiful golden bridal gown lying on the bed of purple roses. "Oh, I shall wear it to the wedding," the queen-to-be exclaimed, running to take hold of the marvelous garment. But before she could reach it, Johannes grabbed it from the flower bed and strode it to the great hall, where he threw it into the fire. Again, the party was taken with cries of shock and dismay. The servants huddled together and whispered, "Treason! Treason!" But the king hushed them. "Johannes has always been faithful to me and to my family, so I will be faithful to him. If he does it, it must be right." The young king and the golden princess were married the very next day. The princess looked particularly beautiful, her ocean blue eyes brimming with joy, but Johannes watched anxiously. They moved to dance and the music began, but they had not taken 2 steps when the new queen suddenly swooned and fell to the ground. Before anyone could move, Johannes swept in, lifted her to his chest, and carried her out of the hall. He hurried through empty hallways, carrying the new queen in his arms, to a narrow, winding staircase that led to the highest turret in the castle, his private chamber. When they arrived, he placed her carefully on the floor, bent over her, and with his 2 rotten teeth, bit her lip until he drew blood. Then, ever so tenderly, the unhandsome man sucked 3 drops of blood from her lip with his mouth. The queen began to stir, but just then the king burst into the room. He had followed Johannes all through the palace and had watched at a crack in the door as Johannes, his once faithful Johannes, had done something unspeakable to his new queen. "Treason!" he bellowed at the top of his lungs. "Treason!" The other servants quickly ran to the king's aid. "King," Johannes said, "please trust me." "Take him to the dungeons," the young king shouted. "Tomorrow he dies." The next day, Johannes was led from the dungeons to the top of the funeral pyre. There he was tied as a torch was ready to set the great stack of hay and tinder on fire. The king watched with his new queen at his side. He had fully recovered from the day before. Both wore black, and their faces were somber. "He was like a father to me," the young king said. The queen took his hand. The executioner lit his torch and brought it to the pyre, its sparks leaping eagerly at the dry tinder. Behind the king, the jealous servants muttered and smiled to one another. But just before the executioner could set the pyre alight, Johannes called out, "King! King, to whom I have been most faithful, and to whose father and father's father and father's father's father I was faithful before that. Will you please allow me to speak before I die?" The young king sadly inclined his head and said, "Speak." And so Johannes spoke. He told of seeing the 3 ravens on the ship. He told of hearing them speak. He told of their prophecy of the chestnut stallion. And he told it, he turned to stone from the tips of his toes to the knobs of his knees. And as he told it, all the spectators gasped, but Johannes went on. He told of the raven's prophecy of the bridal gown. And as he did, he turned to stone from the knobs of his knees to the core of his heart. In the crowd, mouths fell open. Finally, he told of the raven's prophecy of the wedding dance. And when he turned to stone from the core of his heart to the top of his head, and he died. A great wail went up from all assembled, for they had learned too late that Johannes had been faithful to the very end and had given his life for his king. The king and the queen, in an effort to honor his memory, took faithful Johannes, grotesque even in stone, and placed him beside their bed, so that every morning when they woke up and every evening when they lay down, they would be reminded of his faithfulness and the great debt they owed him. The end. Until tomorrow.